Welcome to this afternoon's session on Words Matter, Narratives and Discourses of Violent Extremism and Terrorism. My name is Mark Duckworth. I'll be chairing this session. There will be two sessions of 20 minutes presentations and then 20 minutes for questions. The first presentation is a presentation called The Importance of Alternative Narrative Interventions for Prevention Landscape by Dr. Vivian, Gerrand, Devitt, and Dr. Joshua Roose, all from the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. Beck and Vivian are going to present, and Josh will be here for questions afterwards. So over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Can you all see the PowerPoint slides?
Yes.
Great. Today we're talking about the importance of alternative narrative interventions for the prevention landscape. Alternative narrative interventions are an under-researched critical part of addressing violent extremism and radicalisation to terrorism, and also for addressing broader issues surrounding polarisation. In contrast to counter-narratives, alternative narratives directly address root causes, such as real and perceived grievances, as well as the psychosocial needs that may lead to engagement with extremist discourse. They have a significant role to play, therefore, in sustainable redirection away from violent action. Evidence in the field of terrorism studies on the efficacy of alternative narratives is still limited, however. This paper presents the findings of a recent rapid evidence assessment of alternative narratives that was funded by AVERT and was undertaken with Professor Shakira alongside the presenters today of this paper and Josh Roose. It reflects on how alternative narratives differ from the counter-narrative approaches and considers the qualities of good alternative narratives within a framework of pro-social resilience. At a time of heightened vulnerability and diminished trust in institutions, how do these interventions encourage a shift away from friend-enemy polarities and mobilise social capital to support resilience to violence? We provide some examples of alternative interventions to illuminate their role in building pro-social resilience to radicalisation. Finally, we consider at the end of the paper whether and how the brave measure of youth resilience to violent extremism, pioneered by Michelle Grossman and others in a study of youth across Australia and Canada, might be fruitfully applied to evaluate such interventions in the alternative narrative space. So where can we situate alternative narratives? If we think about the violent radicalisation landscape and thinking about the ways in which we know such radicalisation occurs, usually with an interplay of both push and pull factors, we know that the radicalisation process requires an interplay of these factors. It requires both a conducive environment and it requires messaging and unique selling points that then appeal to people. Thinking in terms of alternative narratives, we understand alternative narratives to work both at the level of messaging and at the level of addressing conducive environment. So they're not simply a counter-messaging exercise, as has happened with some counter-narrative campaigns in the CVE space. They are therefore a more sustainable, we argue, way to redirect people away from violent action. But they're also interventions that are not neatly, they don't necessarily neatly fit in either within this framework. And when we think in more broadly in terms of the conducive environment of polarisation, many of these interventions are occurring at a very much a pre-radicalisation stage. They're not necessarily working with people that have been radicalised or that are members of a particular terrorist organisation. They're more interested in working with people who are fence sitters, people who might be drawn but may not be. So it's a really interesting and exciting space. It's also a difficult space for that reason to evaluate, because it's not clear cut in the way that some of the programs that have specifically been designed to counter terrorism or to counter violent extremism have been. So what is an alternative narrative? Alternative narrative is one that, as I said, addresses root causes, real and perceived grievances, as well as the psychosocial needs that may lead to engagement with extremist discourse. An alternative narrative is one that acknowledges the kernel of truth in violent extremist messaging, but it also has credible messages and messengers. It redirects rather than de-radicalising. It is context specific and tends to be grassroots rather than top down. It stands for rather than against something. So many counter-narrative campaigns have been attempts to go against an existing propaganda exercise, and in many ways have reinforced the kinds of parameters of that propaganda rather than offering something different. And so in that sense, they've actually at times done more harm than good. If we think about the Prevent scheme in the UK, a lot has been written about how that's perpetuated suspect communities. So alternative narratives also empower engaging their audience as active agents. Alternative narratives produce their own sophisticated multimodal content, meaning representation practices, so videos, memes, music, and online posts that convey alternative messages that meet people where they're at. So they work at the level of affect and imagination, not simply fact-checking or telling people they're wrong. They can be created or co-created with the targeted audience. We found that was a really effective modality used by some of the alternative narrative interventions, which Beth will talk about in a moment. They also promote ambiguity and agonism or good conflict. So they're promoting a democratic space in which it's possible to have political opponents without those opponents becoming adversaries who must be, or enemies who must be destroyed. Alternative narratives also inspire critical thinking. They occur both on and offline. And a lot of presenters so far in the AVERT conference have talked about the importance of thinking about these together and not thinking about them as separate, not limiting ourselves to only focusing on online, but focusing on the interaction between the two. Many of these narratives may shift us from us and them to we, although this we is always a problematized we. They shift us from an either or situation of black and white thinking to a both and situation in which there's a possibility of complexity, complex cultural identity, in which there's not necessarily a strong sense of certainty and there's more openness. As I said before, they target fence sitters and they're not explicitly within a countering or preventing violent extremist framework. Lastly, they complement and contribute to structural change. So we're thinking about a variety of different ways in which people are now radicalising, especially in the context of COVID-19, and some forms of radicalisation are not necessarily clearly yet in the domain of violence, but they're certainly in the domain of polarisation, and they are, as we've seen in recent months in Melbourne in the long lockdown, the kinds of violence that can come as a result of this sort of polarisation and disinformation. So this is a really interesting example that we're going to show to you now, also because we want to wake everyone up after lunch. And so we'll just think about this is also in terms of the capacity of the alternative narrative to disrupt. And this was a narrative produced for a show on the ABC called Gerrand, which is a show that's critical of ads and has produced its own ad.
I'm from Paper Moose. Doing your own research is great, but there's something to be said for trusting our top scientists. We hope you enjoy.
You're having a reaction. You're gonna be fine. Hold still.
Wait, what brand EpiPen is that?
I don't know.
What's in it?
Medicine.
Medicine? How long is it research for?
I don't know.
What are the stats from Europe?
You could die.
What does Joe Rogan say? Culture.
We don't question the science when our life depends on it, so why question it when millions of lives depend on it? Science has our backs. Get the vax.
That was obviously a satirical pro-vaccination video, but it was one that was actually picked up by Joe Rogan himself and reposted on his Instagram page. Rogan is a figure who promotes alternative, unproven scientific remedies to treat COVID. He himself recently had COVID and apparently threw the kitchen sink at it. He has 13.4 million followers. And this post, so he reposted the video and attracted over 21,000 comments, which is one of I think it's the post that's attracted the most interaction on all of his different posts that I've reviewed. And so the message of the pro-vaccine message actually reached his vaccine or anti-vaccine, vaccine hesitant and anti-vax audience. And so it's a really interesting example of the way in which a video that is using humour can actually promote and disrupt the kind of the narratives that someone like Rogan is promoting. And Rogan himself has been really critical of Australia and commented in response to this video, not only has Australia had the worst reaction to the pandemic with dystopian police state measures that are truly inconceivable to the rest of the civilised world, but they also have the absolute dumbest propaganda. And he then realised and edited saying, apparently this is not a real ad, it's from a satirical show. So it's giving this kind of pro-vaccine message and pro-social message a platform. And as the Gruen acknowledges, this is the best publicity they've ever received. So we thought it was a really interesting example to include. We haven't evaluated it necessarily as being an ongoing alternative narrative, but we are thinking about it in terms of the kind of disruptions that can occur through viral alternative messaging on these social media platforms. I'll now hand it over to my colleague Beck to present some other examples of alternative narratives that we found.
Thanks, Vivian. And if we just go to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about a number of case studies that we found in our research that look at some effective alternative narrative interventions. The first case study that I'm going to look at is a case study called Dare to Grey that was developed by a group of students, 21 students at Utrecht University, who really wanted to try and address far-right extremist narratives and some of the discourse that was emerging out of the 2016 European refugee crisis. And instead of addressing the extremist narrative itself, what they did was really try to address the us versus them sort of narrative, or sort of the anti-immigration narratives and anti-refugee narratives that were emerging out of that debate. And they developed a social media campaign that really tried to challenge polarization in society by trying to promote a space for debate and discussion by promoting different views and voices through audiovisual content online. So in particular through Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, as well as a website that they designed. And they actually worked with a number of local content creators to develop these videos that really promoted diversity, debate, and empathy. And the social media campaign itself has an estimated reach of over 10 million people. It should be noted that this particular example of an alternative narrative intervention purely focuses on a social media campaign. And we found during our research that the more effective approaches to alternative narratives and the interventions that go with them are ones that form a part of a suite of programs that include social work programs or education programs. The other point that we found whilst doing this research was that the number of alternative narrative interventions that were focused on far-right narratives was quite limited. The majority of alternative narrative intervention programs that we found, or pilot programs, tended to be focused on the Muslim community. So there's much more work that needs to be done in this space. If we go to the next slide, Vivian. Our next case study is a case study that demonstrates how, in particular, government institutions can play a role in providing funding and resources to support grassroots initiatives. We found throughout our research that the most effective alternative narrative interventions were those that actually were presented by credible messengers at the grassroots level, that there was a lot more distrust of messages that were coming from governments. So the Strengthening Resilience to Violent Extremism, or Strive 2 program that ran in Kenya from 2016 to 2020 is a good example of how a government-funded program can actually have an impact. So the program itself was funded by the EU and was developed by the Royal United Services Institute, but it was delivered at the grassroots level. And it was an alternative narrative program or preventative communication program that engaged with a number of young men and women that were viewed to be at risk in areas where Al-Shabaab recruitment occurred. And they used the criteria of social networks and observable behaviours and really invited some of these young men and women to join a mentorship program. And the project also included workshops on radio training and content creation, with participants actually disseminating their content in print media, as well as circulating this content through social media platforms. But what was really unique about the Strive 2 program was that instead of actually addressing some of the extremist narratives, what the mentorship program did was actually encourage participants to discuss their own experiences, their hopes and fears, rather than common narratives to emerge out of the extremist space. And they really tried to get participants to address fears around finding a job, finding a partner, and family relationships. And this very much links in with the discussion that Vivian mentioned earlier around how alternative narratives try to actually address some of the psychosocial social aspects that might lead people down the path of finding some of these extremist narratives themselves. And it was actually found during the workshops that the participants themselves almost had an emotional catharsis because they were able to really talk about feelings and loss of identity, or trying to find a sense of belonging, and being able to speak to a room full of strangers really helped to empower them, particularly in Kenya, where in a lot of the media, young people were portrayed as being terrorists, and sort of particularly Islam was linked with poverty and violence as well. So the Strive 2 program really demonstrated how actually encouraging participants to be in a space where they could feel free to talk about their experiences in terms of that sense of loss of belonging, as well as critically debate some of the issues within Kenya was really crucial. What we really found during our research was that despite some of these examples being government funded, one of the highly cited case studies that was included in a lot of the literature really focused on these grassroots initiatives. And this is the next case study that I'm going to talk about in a bit of detail, which is Jamal Al-Kateb, or My Path from Austria. And Jamal Al-Kateb, or My Path, was a program developed by a coalition of filmmakers, former extremists, Muslims and non-Muslims, Islamic studies scholars, as well as social workers, to really try and engage and to try and address some of the factors that really led young people in particular towards the extremist narratives in Austria. And they did this by developing a fictional character called Jamal Al-Kateb, which was born out of biographic information from a lot of the participants within the NGO itself. And they developed a number of videos using a lot of the jihadi propaganda aesthetics themselves, and including video game aesthetics as well as music and sound, to actually try and engage with some of the grievances that young people had, including feelings of sort of discrimination and debate and discussion around racial discrimination and institutional racism as well. And it really created a space to debate these particular issues and to promote tolerance as well. And if we just go to the next slide, Vivian. Jamal Al-Kateb in particular really set out to sort of deliver some of these alternative narratives to try and really initiate discussion and encourage self-reflection as well. And we've got a bit of a little picture there that sort of talks about how it promotes this tolerance. But what we actually found through our research was that despite the fact that there are a number of examples of effective alternative narrative programs, measuring them is quite difficult. And if we go to the next slide, Vivian. So the literature in particular was inconclusive on how alternative narratives actually engage with target audiences. A lot of the measurements and evaluations tend to be based on social media metrics, such as likes, views, and reach. And whilst we found that sort of social network analysis was quite helpful in identifying and understanding social networks that support violent extremism, it actually doesn't measure whether there has been any form of self-reflection or whether the views of those that have actually looked at these alternative narratives have shifted as a result of looking at this messaging. So what I'm going to do now is pass back to Vivian, who is going to talk about a potential alternative approach to measuring alternative program or narrative programs.
Thanks, Beck. One of the ways in which we might productively consider the efficacy of alternative narrative interventions or programs is through the BRAVE measure. As mentioned earlier, the BRAVE measure was designed to measure youth resilience to violent extremism. It was a study undertaken that was led by Michelle Grossman and Michael Ungar across Australia and Canada. And it found that when young people have 5 traits in particular, they're likely to be resilient to violent extremism. And I won't go into detail about the measure because we don't have a lot of time, but I will say briefly that the measure comprises 3 aspects of social capital, so that complex, which together provide complex cultural identity, and it also comprises 2 violence-related aspects, including behaviours and beliefs. And so when there are non-violent beliefs and behaviours combined with complex cultural identity and trust, people are more likely to be, according to this measure, resilient to violent extremism. So when we think about the kinds of interventions and we think about what they're doing, when we talk about non-violence, we can also think in terms of moving from the antagonism of terrorist organisations that promote the friend and the enemy to the agonism of adversaries who are in a good conflict together. So they don't agree, but they're not going to turn to violence as a consequence. So the kinds of interventions that promote that space of struggle and good conflict are ones that we think we could see as being one benchmark for the efficacy. The other one is the complex cultural identity and whether that's present as a resource for belonging and living well together. And the other aspect is the rearranging of cultural variables and taken for granted understandings of self and the other, which can be thought of in terms of the bridging capital, so the ability to relate to people who are not necessarily like-minded. And so finally, finish with this slide because one of the other aspects, as we mentioned, of alternative narratives is they might be a program or they might be a broader societal narrative that we're wanting to provide an alternative to, because as Maura Conway was saying in her keynote address this morning, we really do need to be thinking along the lines of different disciplinary approaches to understanding violent radicalisation and terrorism. And one thing that we need to be thinking about is the way that particular images tell stories about who can belong and who belongs where. And those stories can either facilitate social inclusion or they can facilitate social exclusion and further marginalisation and reintroduce and reinforce suspect communities. So on the left of this slide, we have a picture of the police officers enforcing the burkini ban in France. And that's a symbol of a broader issue in the French context that has reproduced this idea of the Muslim as suspect rather than the Muslim as French. And the threat to be French is an act of assimilation in this context. You must assimilate, you must prove that you're not visibly religious in order to be French. So that's not, that's actually an either or rather than a both and. And the same thing is used in the propaganda of so-called Islamic State. The world is divided into 2 camps, you're either with us or you're against us, one or the other. And then, so moving to both and, the alternative narrative, this is a magazine cover from 2017, then supermodel Halima Aden was an American beauty. She's Muslim, she's American, there's no contradiction, no problem. And there's a young woman holding up proudly the magazine. So she doesn't feel conflicted, she doesn't feel marginalised, she feels included. And we'll end on that note. Thank you.
Vivian and Beck, thank you very much indeed. We come now to our second presentation, a presentation on discourses of terrorism after Christchurch, rupture or continuity. And the presenters are Scheherazade Bloul from Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation, Tasnim Mahmoud Sammak from Monash University, and Dr. Shakira Hussein from the University of Melbourne. So I will pass over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen.
And I remind people to put questions in the Q&A, and you can start doing that now. Thank you.
Okay, I think Shakira, if you want to head it off and unmute yourself. Shakira, I think you're on mute.
Okay. I'll just bring up the right document. Okay. We acknowledge that we meet and speak to you from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and the fight for social justice is ongoing. We also extend that acknowledgement to all the Aboriginal lands you are joining us from, in particular the lands of the Ngunnawal people, where the power centre of the state resides. You probably recognise this photo of Haji Dawud Nabi, the first person to die at the hands of the Australian terrorists who killed 51 Muslim men, women and children as they attended Friday prayers in Christchurch in March 2019. And you're almost certainly familiar with the fact that he greeted his killers with the word "hello brother" at the entrance of the Al Noor Mosque. I open with this image despite its familiarity so that we don't allow his memory and those of the other victims of that atrocity to be erased by the shadow of the man who killed them and the politicians, policymakers, and of course academics who continue to debate the implications of the crime at events like this. For Muslims living in Australia, the shock of the Christchurch massacre was compounded by the fact that this was a crime we had long foretold. I was reminded of my response to the Utoya massacre, which claimed 68 lives in 2011. Always, at some point during Muslim congregations, I find myself remembering some of the ugly email that I've received, glancing towards the door and imagining the shadow of someone like Breivik waiting outside. As Walid Ali said immediately after Christchurch, the most dishonest thing would be to say, "I'm shocked." I'm simply not. If we're honest, we knew this had been coming, end quote. It's not as though this was the first such attack on Muslims living in the West, although it was the most spectacular, live streamed by Facebook, as you know. In the hours after the attack, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern gave a much acclaimed speech in which she said, "They are us. The person who has perpetuated this violence is not. They have no place in New Zealand. There is no place in New Zealand for such acts of extreme and unprecedented violence," which this act clearly was. Ardern's embrace of the Muslim community and her actions in the wake of Christchurch were acclaimed around the world. Her speech, her visiting the mosque and covering her hair while she did so, and more concrete moves such as the immediate ban on military grade weapons, the ban on the manifesto and the footage of the crime, the Christchurch call, the international call to try to rein in social media, from which he had connected with other extremists and to which he had broadcast his crime. Her refusal to say the name of the offender, an example that we're following today in recognition of the pain that it may cause for those to whom this crime strikes close to home. I visited Wellington a couple of weeks after the attack, and members of the congregation spoke of the comfort that her response had provided. And there was, at least for a moment, a hope that Christchurch might prove a turning point in attitudes towards the far right and Islamophobia in general in the West. Our paper interrogates the issue of whether those hopes were well-founded. Scheherazade will interrogate Ardern's claim that violence like that committed in Christchurch in 2019 had no place in New Zealand, against the broader issue of the loss of innocent narratives in settler colonial nations founded on the violent dispossession of First Nations people. While Ardern described the Christchurch killer as not us, for those of us living in Australia, he brought to mind the title of Agnes Sierstad's book about the Utoya terrorist, One of Us. Tasnim will then address the issue of whether the post-9/11 mechanisms of securitization that have been used to contain and discipline Muslim communities are an appropriate instrument for containing far-right extremism, part of the both sides narrative, which has become all too familiar. So I'll hand you across now to Scheherazade.
Thanks, Shakira. And though, as Shakira details, the Christchurch attack has represented a rupture, it also represents continuity in the maintenance of white supremacy in the structures of not only the Australian state, but more broadly, the Western Empire. And as we've seen in these presentations so far in this conference, the definitions of terrorism are expanding, including the belated addition of right-wing extremism. But is it a misnomer to call it extremism when you have people representing that viewpoint in Parliament, the Senate, and in mainstream media? So we take a critical race studies perspective grounded in the work of Aboriginal scholars, that Australia operates as a settler colony on a foundation of white supremacist ideology embedded in the current structures and articulations of the state. This ideology is a continuation of the colonial founding of white Australia on the genocide of Aboriginal people and the theft of their lands. The state has yet to acknowledge its violence, past and present continuing, let alone sign any treaty. Therefore, the white nation constantly reproduces itself to maintain authority over these lands. It decides who is worthy in its eyes, and by doing so, it decides and maintains the lineage of patriarchal white possession. As Professor Eileen Moreton-Robinson has said, Indigenous sovereignty and its existence is both refused and acknowledged through an anxiety of dispossession, which rises to the surface when the nation as a white possession is perceived to be threatened. So as with white supremacy, the replacement theory, rhetoric and anxieties on declining Western /white birth rates were front and centre of the Christchurch Terrorist Manifesto. But this is not exclusive to neo-Nazi groups. During the 2006 debate on the legislation for the RU486, then Liberal Party MP Dana Vale claimed that Australia was in danger of becoming a Muslim nation because we are aborting ourselves almost out of existence. Businessman Dick Smith in 2017 funded campaigns on the need for population control. And of course, as we know, the then One Nation Senator Fraser Anning advocated for a final solution to the immigration, and in particular Muslim, problem during his 2018 speech. So One Nation and sometimes these fleetingly new far-right parties make the LNP seem moderate. Appearing often in mainstream media and at far-right rallies, their rhetoric is not too dissimilar from those in mainstream politics, as evidenced in the 2018 bill, where most coalition senators voted in favour of Pauline Hanson's quickly overturned "It's okay to be white" bill, a slogan that was popularised by white supremacists globally. So on continuity, again, about this time last year, researchers warn that far-right extremists in this country are hiding in plain sight and that racism and xenophobia are becoming normalised. But racist and xenophobic discourse has always been a key feature of the Australian state. And here I'd like to refer to Professor Moreton-Robinson again, and her argument that one of the ways in which white supremacist structures are maintained is through a discourse of security, which supports the existence, protection and maintenance of patriarchal white sovereignty. So like me, the terrorist, the Christchurch terrorist, we're the same age, spent his formative years in the climate of former Prime Minister John Howard's political discourse of anxiety and fear of dispossession, thus legitimising securitized responses. As Chris Graham points out, Howard joined the Liberal Party at a time when unacknowledged slavery of Aboriginal people was taking place and rhetoric for its permissibility continuing as late as 1986. And this was only a few years before we were both born. At the outset of the War on Terror in 2001, the Tampa election took place under the slogan, "We'll decide who comes to this country." And during the 2005 Cronulla beach riots, mobs of white Australians set about on a purifying mission to take back our beaches. The riot was amplified by shock jocks like Alan Jones, but as Ghassan Haj points out, this was enabled by a government, a state and a country, along with its media infrastructure, founded on white supremacy, white nationalism and colonial violence. So it did not occur in a social vacuum. Racialized political spectacles were also used to legitimize the NT intervention, the Stop the Boats campaign to legitimize indefinite detention and incarceration of certain people fleeing wars and conflict that Australia was involved in. So Howard's muscular stance has been praised by far-right politicians in Europe, not to mention the Utoya terrorist. His manifesto praised Australian values and border policies as the most sensible in the Western world. And this was only in 2011. And the Utoya terrorist, the Breivik, was also the Christchurch terrorist key inspiration for the attack. So the claim by both the state and Liberals that white supremacists are not us is rendered possible by depictions of and the representation of white supremacist figures, such as Blair Cottrell, which we have on the screen, as Australia's version of Hillary Clinton's infamous basket cases of deplorables. Yet the aforementioned political discourse that has been catapulted into and maintained in the mainstream promotes similar rhetoric of invasion of the other, in particular Muslims. It's perhaps more a question of brand differentiation, as Shakira has documented at Reclaim Australia rallies, where being surrounded by white supremacists is not too dissimilar from witnessing an average day in Parliament. So back to Christchurch, similarly, there has been continuity in naming the killer as an outlier. Doing so perpetuates the lone wolf stereotype reserved for white men and white nationalists alike, and decontextualizes the society and the rhetoric in which they were radicalized. He's just a freak, a weirdo, or he's the too racist kind of racist. He is not us. His manifesto, if we read it, is not incoherent. It quotes mainstream Australia, the need to halt Muslim migrations, fear of invasion, declining Western birth rates that I mentioned earlier. So analysis conducted by the Melbourne Asia Institute on the media coverage immediately after the attack took place found that Australian media paid too much attention to the perpetrator's personal hardship. There was an equation of white supremacy and Islamic extremism, and not due attention paid on the structural causes of hate crimes. Australia, its political leadership and media infrastructure did not want to take public responsibility for an attacker so close to home, so to speak, unlike the vilification that Muslim communities face in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. And our paper that we're developing will provide further analysis and research on news media as well as social media after Christchurch. As we know, there has been a shift in official terminology, but this only occurred after several politicians took offence with the use of the words right wing. This stands in contrast to the unaddressed community concerns about Islamic terrorism wording and their real life consequences years prior. And although the terminology change is welcome, it does not mean the focus, scrutiny and policing will be lessened on Muslim or othered communities. And there is also little to indicate if there will be substantial monitoring of incel violence directed at women. So this is recalling what I said earlier about white patriarchal violence. And as Tasnim will detail in the following section, this is not necessary to say we need to incorporate carceral systems to surveil, follow and intercept. We want to bring it home to the structural inequalities globally, but especially here on these stolen Aboriginal lands.
Thanks, Scheherazade. So to follow on here, I want to raise 2 points that illustrate how post-Christchurch discourse dangerously represents very little change and much continuity towards securitization and entrenched white supremacy. Firstly, we do not see promises to get the bad, violent breed of racists as currently sufficient nor genuine in being able to protect Muslim and other racialized communities from their attacks. And there is substantial work written warning against the expansion of counter-terror legislation, both concerning the curtailing of civil liberties and warning that such granted powers will be used to repress marginalized groups and oppositional groups deemed enemies of the state. It's not coincidental that we saw Dutton list Muslim extremism alongside left-wing extremism. As an example, after the attacks on the US Capitol at the beginning of this year, the Council on American Islamic Relations lawyers wrote that more domestic terrorism laws aren't the answer. They suggested that previous laws attempting to address domestic insurrection were ultimately used to stifle dissent, adding that, and I quote, "It's not the lack of domestic terrorism laws that led law enforcement to move barricades or take selfies with violent agitators." These sentiments were echoed in the halls of power by Representative Ilhan Omar, who flipped the war on terror's discourse and said, "We must not give in to fear or allow ourselves to be terrorized by those who seek to harm us. The answer is not a broader security structure or a deeper police state." This is a shift in politics and a counter discourse that we welcome. Ackerman Daily Beast editor points out that Omar occupies a unique place in the imagination of radical white terror. She embodies everything that people who wear Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts consider the eminent end of America, political power in the hands of a left-wing Black Muslim woman. I would argue that it is exactly this knowing and insight into white supremacy that leads her to insist against the expansion of the counter-terror apparatus. It is not a lack of powers or infrastructure, but rather a lack of political will that emboldens white radical terror. An analysis by the Brennan Center for Justice, for example, has found that the FBI has all the powers they need, while the brutal policing of Black Lives Matter and other social justice protesters has emboldened white supremacists to act with impunity and conviction. Here we see policing itself serving to radicalize and inspire rather than contain white supremacist groups. If we return to Aotearoa, after the Lynn Mall terrorist attack in September this year, the second reading of the counter-terrorism bill was fast-tracked through Parliament, with Greens Party, ACT and Tea Party Maori voting against the bill, arguing that proper consultation of communities was needed. Greens Party MP Tinau Tuono spoke strongly regarding this, and I quote, "We all want the safety for our families, for our communities. We want the best for all of us living here in this Winoa. But I am concerned of the balance of keeping people safe while also making sure we uphold human rights. That balance takes time in order to make sure that mistakes don't target the wrong communities," close quote. And he was citing the Te Orewera raids as reason for caution. Rather than welcoming swift expansion of counter-terror measures, we welcome emerging dissent that calls for needed caution that is a break from the suspension of critical thinking in the days after the 9/11 attacks 20 years ago. In parliaments, from human rights organizations, and in activist and anti-fascist spaces, we are seeing more vocal opposition to the passing of draconian anti-terror legislation today that was unfortunately quite rare and fragmented in the early years of heightened nationalism, when much of this counter-terror infrastructure was designed and legislated in both Australia and Aotearoa. Though a little late, this willingness to break from the debilitating "you are either with us or against us" think is something we ought to capitalize upon. We ought to listen to the words of activists such as Valerie Morse of Peace Action Wellington, who says, "Their only answer to such events is more police, more prisons, and more spies. The problem is that these responses don't work." These perspectives are not new, though they have been sidelined over the past 20 years. Ghassan Haj points to this national failing to address the heightening mainstreaming of racism in what he calls the cater for our sensitivity or we will explode type of politics that Hansen peddles. As Western nations find it easy to pass new counter-terror measures, Haj argues that the radical politics we need, the politics of ridding us of the culture of the fed up that generates and legitimizes them, is yet to begin. We insist that the lack of willingness to invest in unpopular legislative, social, cultural, and community infrastructure and to implement strategies that will generate little populist support will mean a continuity of white supremacy. As Haj urges, rejecting this politics of emotional blackmail should be part and parcel of the rejection of the justificatory claims embodied in statements such as "driven too far" or "the racist fed up." And as a second and important point, we also do not see Australian or New Zealand government commitments to fight white supremacist terrorism as a sudden wake up or national point of rupture from a supposed approval of white extremism. While the racism is indeed sanctioned by political and media establishment, we believe that both settler colonies have been post-racial in ideology, identifying as multicultural, progressive, democratic, and harmonious societies where racism is rejected. There is a continuity here in pledging to uproot these fascist excesses while asserting civilizational superiority. As Dr. Sahar Gamka, who grew up in Aotearoa, reflected in the aftermath of the Christchurch attack, racism is what produces statements like "this is not us," that seek to absolve and reject responsibility and shame, and replace them with fragile innocence and even pride. We see efforts to expand the definition of terrorism as a dangerous rhetorical equalizer that claims to end all political violence while absolving the settler state of its oppressions. As a redemptive project and move to white innocence, the good liberal nation is able to distance itself from the likes of the Christchurch terrorists. And to conclude, with such swift redemption, there is a lost opportunity for the reckoning, truth-telling, decolonizing, building work the settler societies require. In our paper, we expand upon what we mean by this reckoning in reference to the work of Indigenous scholars who provide possibilities for anti-racism and decolonization that features little in terrorism studies, despite the terror of settler colonial violence that leads to social and political decay. Perhaps we can end with a scholarly provocation. How can we address violent extremism without addressing Aboriginal sovereignty, the destruction of Aboriginal sacred sites for the profit of private companies, or to build new roads, as in the case of Jabwarung, the extreme basis of the settler state? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have a couple of questions here, and I encourage people to post more questions into the Q&A function that we have. The first question is addressed to Vivian, Beck, and Josh, which is, how successful do you feel alternative narratives could be in the context of addressing conspiracy theorists? Who'd like to take that? Vivian?
I'm happy to speak to that. I think alternative narratives have the potential to be very effective in that space because they are paying attention to the underlying grievances that motivate people to adhere to conspiracy theories. They're not simply wanting to say to someone who has taken on board a theory, you're wrong. They're actually wanting to listen to why that person has gone down that road of engaging and formulate a different way of imagining the situation. So they're definitely not a quick fix, but I think there is a lot of potential in the space of alternative narratives to tackle problems associated with conspiracy theories. I'd open it up to the team, Josh and Beck, to add to that.
I'll let Beck go first. I've got something to say.
Yeah, look, I agree with Vivian that, alternative narratives, can certainly work in the space of conspiracy theories. And I think particularly as we see a lot of the conspiracy theories propagated by QAnon, for example, as well as a lot of the anti-vaxxer sort of conspiracy theories that are emerging, I think alternative narratives can play a really important role, particularly in encouraging empathy and understanding. If we look, for example, at QAnon, there is a diverse demographic that engages with those conspiracy theories. So being able to try and address some of those pro-social aspects that might lead people to actually engage with these conspiracy theories, I think is really important, and alternative narratives can be a tool to do that as well. And I'll pass on to Josh.
Yeah, not much to add. I think you picked up on the important points, in particular the demographic diversity of conspiracy theorists. And we talked yesterday about the fact that many of these people are educated to varying extents, often even university educated. So it's about anyone, most of us have probably met someone or had someone in our lives who's subscribed to these theories in some capacity. You can't just tell people they're wrong, because that meets you're just part of the problem, aren't you? You're built in. So part of it is unpacking and doing the actual research to understand where these people are coming from, what parts of the community. We've really got to delve into and continue that research to understand them. There's such a new phenomenon with such a diversity of ideological strands and so on, that the work needs to be done to better understand where they're coming from in order to develop those alternative narratives, but certainly big potential.
Thank you. A question here for Scheherazade. How significant a role have some of our mainstream politicians and parts of the media played in fueling the rise of right-wing extremism? More importantly, how do we counter some of their divisive rhetoric?
I might just start with the first part and then also see if Shakira and Tasnim want to participate in that first part, and then we'll answer the second part if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, so as I detailed in the speech, I think it's been very significant. So if you go to these, some of these Reclaim Australia rallies in the early days of these, right-wing extremism expansion, some of the things that they were saying, the speakers, well, they were quoting politicians, and they were quoting people like Andrew Bolt. So I think it's and there's a lot of research that attests to this. Also, in Europe, some far right parties, I forgot his name, it's Gert something. In particular, was very vocal. Thank you. In particular, was very vocal about how Europe should adopt some of Australia's policies. Gert was also, front and centre at a lot of far-right rallies in Europe, in particular in 2015 with the migration issues that were occurring. I don't know if Shakira and Tasnim, you want to also talk about this?
Tasnim, do you want to?
Also,
Shakira
sorry,
or Tasnim?
I just want to say one more thing.
Yes.
I think it's very significant because the politicians set the tone for what is acceptable, what is acceptable to say as well. Sorry, now Shakira and Tasnim.
Shakira, do you have a comment?
I would echo what Scheherazade said. I think media as well. I'm reminded of crossing paths with the soldiers of Odin, admittedly at a time when they hadn't been widely identified as belonging to the far right. And The Age had an article about them the day before. I asked them what they thought of that article. They said, "Oh, pretty pleased, really. Didn't misrepresent us like I thought it might." But that wasn't a isolated instance of far right people at rallies being basically pleased with the PR they were getting. And I don't think that's shifted that much, although of course now it's mostly online rather than those, until these anti-lockdown rallies, which they were present again. So, but Tasnim?
But also what's online, sorry if I can just jump in as well. Politicians like Craig Kelly have a huge presence on Telegram. The anti-lockdown rallies linked to several politicians, in particular, Craig Kelly, who's been noted to say racist and obviously anti-vaxxer stuff. Sorry, Tasnim.
George Christensen.
Yeah, Tasnim.
Yes. I would agree with those comments, and I can take the next question, so I don't need to expand too much here. But I think, the built-up patriotism, especially in a post 9/11 era, definitely, there is that. I mean, it's really difficult to deny that. Like, we can look at the work of, for example, Michael Apple on ideology and curriculum. There's been a lot of warning there about what happens when we see the war on terror rhetoric, the binary of, you're either with us or against us. And I think that what we're seeing 20 years later is exactly the ramifications of that discourse from political and media establishment. So, I guess the case we're making is that when we do acknowledge that, then we can take that seriously as a nation and do the work that needs to happen, the anti-racism work, rather than focus on a fringe group as though racism is external, and as though we are a post-racial society.
Thank you. The next question's for Vivian and Beck, from a colleague in South Australia, saying, we undertake a comprehensive psychosocial assessment of every client we induct into our CVE program and try to focus on boosting their resilience rather than shifting their ideological beliefs. Do you have any thoughts on the efficacy of using the BRAVE measure with individuals that have already radicalized to track their change over the course of a CVE intervention? Vivian.
Thanks for the question. I don't have any evidence to hand of the use of the BRAVE measure in that context, but I welcome. I would encourage you to check it out and see whether it could be a good fit for what you're doing.
Any other comments from Josh or Beck on that? If not, I'll move to the next question, which is addressed to our second paper, to Tasnim and Scheherazade and Shakira. Thank you for the radical critique of existing counter-terrorism approaches. It seems that you are arguing that the most effective response to right-wing extremism would be a self-reflexive examination of existing settler colonial power structures and the way they perpetuate racism. Do you think there is any place for more traditional counter-narrative responses in this context? Who'd like to respond? Shakira or Tasnim? Yes.
Yeah, I can respond briefly. That I think, it's important to think about what are these traditional counter-narrative responses, because a lot of the counter-narrative sort of theoretical underpinning emerged from critical theory and critical race theory. And the idea was to counter dominant hegemonic narratives. So if we're talking about, counter-narrative work, then I think that would involve some of what we did here, which is to counter the war on terror's narrative. That's the hegemonic narrative, right? The narrative of empire and of state. Whereas what we're seeing is a kind of appropriation of this sort of theoretical work in a way that doesn't center the oppressed, victimized groups' voices. And I think that's quite core to counter-narrative work, especially as it emerges from critical race theory, that the goal is to kind of provide alternative stories that are able to tell us about how white supremacy functions as a structure and how prevalent white supremacy is in society. So, I think that is exactly sort of what we're hoping for, that we do that sort of counter-narrative work.
Shakira or Scheherazade?
Maybe Shakira, if you want to say something. I think Tasnim answered that very well.
If I give a very delayed response.
Sorry, Shakira, we can't hear you. There seems to be a buzz online.
I'm not sure what it would be from. I think my laptop possibly is.
Yeah, sorry, we're unable. Yeah, we might move to the next. Can people hear? And we might go to the next question, which is addressed to the first panel talking about alternative narratives, saying how can alternative narratives be, I think be in line, how can they counter the ideology of religious extremism by counter-narratives that speak the same language as the de-radicalization program that use the counter-narrative? So how I suppose the question is really, how can a alternative narrative take the place of a counter-narrative when you're actually seeking to counter a narrative put forward relating to religious extremism? Vivian or Josh?
I would suggest that the question seems to me to be talking about people that may have already radicalized, if I understood it correctly. And if that is the case, I'm not sure how effective an alternative narrative alone would be in that situation. So I don't have a clear answer on that, because the way that we've conceived of the alternative narrative is not so much in dealing with someone that has radicalized, but more someone that is on the fence and is more capable of being influenced. So yeah, it's not about going in and trying to change someone's thinking. It's more about perhaps redirecting. But yeah, it's not clear to me in that context. I don't think that's the way that we're thinking about how they can work. But I mean, Josh, you may have some different views. I'll bet.
Look, to be upfront, the question's not too clear to me. But one thing I'd say is that one of the challenges of alternative narratives that needs work is very much in the realm of, well, what do you do when, as the previous presentation has pointed out, there's a deeper embedded racism in wider society, and how do you come up with a narrative that is able to provide an alternative to that when it's embedded? Our politicians are speaking much of the same language, our key media outlets and so on. So these are some of the challenges to implementing an alternative narrative. I'm particularly focused on alternative narratives as they apply to the far right, and also men who are engaging in anti-women online forums and so on. So it's an emerging field, but I think that's one of the challenges. But again, I'm not too clear on the specific line of questions, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Well, we've now reached our allotted end time, and I'd very much like to thank Vivian, Shakira, Tasnim, Scheherazade, Josh, and Beck for their presentations. And we are now having a break and look forward to everyone engaging in the next session after that break. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.